Hello, and welcome to this fascinating presentation on innovative approaches to student engagement in art history. Is gaming the secret? My name is Amber Munzenberger, and I'm the Director of Learning for Triceum. Today, we are excited to have Dr. Leiderman's development and classroom experience using gaming to inspire and motivate students. First, we have a few poll questions to help us get to know you better, as we'd like the webinar to provide as much value as possible. First, how would you best describe your institution or university? While you're answering this question, and before we get started, I have a few housekeeping tips to make sure everything runs smoothly. If you have any technical difficulties, first, try clicking the Reconnect button at the bottom of your screen. If this doesn't work, please use the chat box to send us a message, and one of us will try to help you. During the webinar, please feel free to type any questions you have for Dr. Leiderman in the chat box as we go. We will answer your questions throughout the webinar and at the end of the presentation. Lastly, we hope you will all follow us on Facebook and Twitter by searching for @Triceum and use the hashtags GBL, Game to Learn, and Gaming. We have one more poll question for you. And while you're answering this poll, I will introduce Dr. Leiderman. Dr. Leiderman teaches art history in the Department of Visualization at Texas A&M University. Prior to joining the faculty at Texas A&M, Daniil defended his dissertation with the Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University. We are honored to have Dr. Leiderman here today to share such valuable information with you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Leiderman.
Hi, and thank you for the introduction, Amber. So today I'll be talking to you about ARTé Mecenas, a computer game that I have used in my Renaissance survey classes, or not Renaissance survey classes, but my Renaissance to Modern survey classes, and a game that I worked on and helped develop. I must have some insight into its inner workings as well as how to apply it in a classroom environment. For me, ARTé Mecenas was a great tool for improving student engagement and giving them various insights into the context that is often difficult to present. I used it in large core curriculum courses, and in those courses, I often find myself focusing on different subject matter than the course requires my students to know. For example, on formal analysis over all the contextual information that I might be presenting to them. ARTé Mecenas was great for helping me provide that context and for encouraging my students to think critically about the differences between their own views on art and the views that were current during the Renaissance and that affected the role of both patronage and art creation during this time. It also provided me with valuable analytics that could be used for measuring my students' progress in a class, seeing whether or not they completed the assignments, and various other such tasks that are often quite important when running both an online and an in-person class. Now, please take a minute and watch this short video that will give you the general description of ARTé Mecenas and tell you what it's all about. And I'll be here when we come back.
To understand art, you must understand artists. To understand artists, you must understand where they came from. Welcome to a whole new way of exploring art history. An immersive experience that takes students straight to the heart of 15th and 16th century Florence. An image of an artwork can only show you the artist's work. But a game can show you the artist's world. As a member of the Medici, you are more than a wealthy banker. You are Mecenas de las Artes, a patron of the arts. What matters is not just the money you make, but your civic reputation and your standing with influential bishops and clergymen. To play as a patron of the arts is to understand where Renaissance art came from. This is ARTé Mecenas. a revolutionary new way to teach art history. In the classroom, students hear and see the artworks and their history. In the game, students discover what it was like to be a patron of the arts and explore the context behind the artists. Successful learning is reported to their teacher, offering an alternative means of earning class credits. Playing to learn, a completely new approach to teaching art history. Welcome to the Renaissance. Welcome to ARTé Mecenas.
And we're back. So now that you see what ARTé Mecenas looks like in general, letting you take the role of a powerful member of the Medici family and guiding that family through most of the significant history of northern Italy in the 15th century, collecting art and participating in important geopolitical events, why use it in the classroom? Well, if you're like me, your large survey classes often are torn between the need to contextualize everything for the students so that they understand what's at stake, what's happening in the world around us, and to really provide us with a lot of that historical information that our historical class relies upon. But I also often need to talk about formal analysis, explain how composition has changed, how the construction of both buildings and sculptures and the space in paintings has changed. And that also takes up class time. And indeed, I tend to prefer to spend my class time focused on formal analysis, putting up an image on the board and engaging with my students to get them to talk about it and see the details that distinguish a Renaissance artwork from a medieval artwork, and really make those kinds of insights central, which means that the economic, political, and trade information often becomes not of secondary importance, but neglected. Thus, for example, I might talk about the sack of Rome, but not go into a great length about why Rome was sacked politically or who all the various actors were involved in it. And that's why ARTé Mecenas is very helpful, because it often provides that exact information and provides it not as a kind of block of text that the students might absorb and internalize and might just kind of forget, but rather as a set of events that build up as the student plays through them and gives them a sense of a kind of historical continuity, where the sack of Rome is not just this embodied moment in time and space, but the conclusion of certain tensions and conflicts that have been built up in the player's own imagination as they went through them. And the same is not just true of politics, but also of the role of economics and trade, which I might emphasize by talking about the role of patronage in the Renaissance, or by assigning a text of contemporary scholarship that deals with it. But it still struggle with getting across the full intensity and entanglement that trade and economics had with art and with artistic patronage during the Renaissance. And again, ARTé Mecenas is great for providing that information as though through the back door, as though without me having to really drive it in for my students, ensuring that after they played the game, they come into my class with some contextual readiness to take that next leap and realize the way that these things are tied together. And as a result, give me a lot more leeway to focus on formal analysis. Furthermore, the game encourages students to apply the knowledge they gain in class. When I teach my students formal principles or historical terminology or contextual information, often it's only applicable when they take a quiz or an exam with me. So they might learn what contrapposto means, get the definition, and learn to recognize it in an artwork or two that I show in class. But then the only next time that they apply such knowledge is when they take an exam with me, or if they're lucky enough to go to a museum, when they go to a museum and look at artworks there and perhaps have a chance to talk about them to their friends or family. This to me is a sad sort of missed opportunity, because there's a lot of ways to talk about formal principles and historical terminology in day-to-day life, and Mecenas encourages students to do so quite directly while engaging with this sort of novel media form, with a video game. And it does so by essentially working through puzzles. Most of ARTé Mecenas' decisions are not really about, say, economics per se. Most of the time, the economics comes down to buying low and selling high. But the real decisions are the non-pragmatic ones, the art historical ones, the ones that suggest that a good business deal might not just involve buying low and selling high, but also pleasing the various trade partners with artistic patronage, or showing yourself off to be a pious and committed member of the community. And all these kinds of puzzles within the game rely upon art historical terminology, formal principles, and contextual information to answer. That students might be asked to choose an image with defined contrapposto. And as a result, this information that they learned in class becomes pragmatically applied, and again, as though through a back door, as though without forcing them to notice that they're being quizzed on it, while they play and organically, which to me makes it a very powerful learning tool, precisely because it grounds all the various abstract and conceptual terms we introduce our students to in material reality in a way that our classes only do sort of on site and with teachers' guidance. So it's a great way to test your students without actually making them take a test. It also teaches complex interlocking systems through what Ian Bogost, the researcher on games, calls procedural rhetoric. And the way Bogost describes procedural rhetoric is as games' unique capability to describe the way whole complex interlocking machines or systems work, and to do so not by simply sitting a student down and explaining every single parcel of the system, in this case, the system of Renaissance patronage and economics and art, to them by beginning with, well, at first there was feudalism, and then on top of it there's religion, and on top of that there's economics, and on top of that there's trade across the Mediterranean, only to arrive to kind of art at the very end. Instead, all these systems come in as a unified whole, and students are simply put in the middle of them and asked to figure the way out, to sink or float. So they learn these systems as interlocked, as mutually reliant, without having to explain to them. They learn them because they figure them out for themselves, because they realize that in order to be successful as Renaissance businessmen, they also need to be patrons of the church. And to be successful patrons of the church, they need to make the right kind of political decisions, and so on and so forth. All these systems rely on one another. And as a result, students essentially pick up the logic of patronage, the significance of art, and all these complex, nuanced ideas about Renaissance economies in the course of simply doing them for themselves, doing the best optimal and kind of most straightforward set of choices that the game presents for them. Furthermore, students get to influence the course of history of playing it out for themselves, but not to the full extent that they could. We've purposely delimited the game to stay within the logic of major historical events. So Rome still gets sacked, there's still a Michelangelo, and there's all these sort of important moments happen, but the player doesn't necessarily get to help them happen. That's, for example, if players fail to support some major artwork created with Medici patronage, another family will support it instead. But as a result, instead of, again, learning Renaissance history as a kind of bulk of information and dates which occasionally line up in a more kind of well-read and informed student's mind, but often turn into a jumble of images, students get to basically experience how Medici power grows, how they establish greater ties within the church, how this connects to existing tensions within the church, and tensions within Italy, and tensions within Europe, and how all these tensions essentially lead to various major historical events. And they experience these events for themselves. Again, so the sack of Rome doesn't just come as this term that they learn in their textbook, but as something that their decisions have led up to, and that has consequences for them. And this makes ARTé Mecenas a very engaging exercise for in-person classes, where students get a sort of a fun and immersive and procedurally effective way of learning about the context, and for online classes, which often struggle with interactivity. After all, online classes are in many ways even more sort of passive than a traditional lecture course, because students are put in a position where they aren't really engaging with each other, can't really directly argue with the professor unless you do a kind of forum, which in a sense turns just into a digital classroom. Whereas ARTé Mecenas gives them an interactive activity that doesn't just ask them to passively receive information, but lets them sort of engage and participate and learn things for themselves in the course of doing them, in the course of applying the terms and concepts that they've learned passively. So I find it to be very effective for both in-person and online classrooms, precisely because it supplements shortcomings in both in-person and online classroom structures. As we developed ARTé Mecenas, the vast majority of the minor events and anecdotes that make up the questions in the game were drawn from anecdotes reported by Giorgio Vasari in his seminal Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, which, as you know, is in many ways one of the first, if not the first, text of art history and a kind of continuity with art history as we study it today. It's often a text that's assigned in introductory or survey classes, particularly with the introductions to the lives or the lives of individual artists, such as the life of Leonardo or Michelangelo, making up many professors' syllabi, especially covering the kind of Renaissance period. So we precisely sought to bring out episodes from Vasari to life and embed the player in them. So they, once again, don't come as just a block of text where Vasari recounts literally everything that happened to an individual artist from the beginning of their lives to the end, but rather as incidents which the player encounters and grows in relationship to. As, for example, as you can see in the image on the right, we presented an event directly out of Vasari where Paolo Di Dono flees from his patron, upset with being fed nothing but cheese. And this amusing anecdote, although not serving any particularly significant function describing Di Dono's life, nevertheless presents the central idea of ARTé Mecenas, namely the artist-patron relationships, and shows us the kind of both comical and tragic ways that artist-patron relationships might have played out during the Renaissance, which is precisely why I'd assigned Vasari in the first place, to offer such a immediate and intimate look, whether or not it is, as we all know, true or not. For we all know Vasari often invented or exaggerated incidents. But for our purposes, that's exactly the kind of tone that the game plays with. For you're put in the position of a patron who's receiving rumors and stories about things happening in their society and responding to them one way or another without necessarily passing some sort of judgment on them. And once again, the procedural rhetoric here teaches players of the entanglement of the artist and the patron during the Renaissance and the various ways that this entanglement plays out. In terms of negotiated contracts, in terms of power inequality, in terms of conflicts over pay and over creations being taken too long, and allows the player to learn all this nuanced, complex information in the course of literally experiencing for themselves. We furthermore developed ARTé Mecenas to kind of juxtapose different economic events, such as the central trading one you see in the middle, with political circumstances. So this economic event, for example, is very profitable for the player, but would likely cause all sorts of negative consequences because it's with the Ottoman Turks, and the religious establishment would, in a sense, punish the player for it, which is measured in the game with the meter, with their piety meter, and a corresponding prestige meter to reflect their secular status. You can see that aside from anecdotes like Paolo Di Dono's, we also discuss major innovations and changes, again, through this kind of choice matter. As you see Luca della Robbia's invention of terracotta and vetriata, and the kind of development of that particular characteristic set of artworks as yet another such event which is going to happen whether or not the player intervenes, but allows for the player to participate as a patron and derive pragmatic benefits from it. So we introduced a lot of important information about the Renaissance and a lot of interesting information about the Renaissance in a way that's not overwhelming, but rather sort of diffused and entangling, in a way that pulls the player in and has them learn a lot of information without noticing that they've learned it, without realizing that they're kind of in the midst of a pedagogical or a kind of almost quiz-like experience. In my classes, I pair ARTé Mecenas with the introduction to part one of Michael Baxandall's painting experience in 15th century Italy, the section called The Conditions of Trade, where Baxandall famously describes the various economic context of Renaissance patronage and the amount of negotiation and meticulousness going into contracts and agreements with artists, as well as the way that this gradually changes in the course of the 15th century with granting artists more and more license. This text is greatly complemented by ARTé Mecenas because not only because ARTé Mecenas essentially follows the same structure of having very kind of rigid and forceful contracts early in the game with increasing agency, largely personified by Michelangelo and his relationship with the Medici family in the later levels of the game. But because the player can, again, procedurally experiment with and internalize the major principles and motives that Baxandao ascribes to 15th and 16th century patron of the arts. Baxandao cites a Florentine merchant's claim that patrons support art to glorify their city, their faith, themselves, for the pleasure and virtue of spending money well. And all of these are necessary for the player to succeed at ARTé Mecenas. Players must struggle to maintain their secular and religious reputations, which you can see are measured within the game through these 2 meters. On the left, to the Medici heraldry, which measures their secular reputation, and on the right, through the altarpiece, which measures their religious reputation. The window in the center, visible through all the levels when the player is not an exile, gives us a scene of the Florentine landscape, which changes as the player supports the arts. For example, in the beginning of the game, the dome of the Duomo is not apparent, but it becomes built if the player supports its creation, well, it gets built anyway, but if the player is able to participate in the creation of the Duomo. Because the players must struggle to maintain their secular and religious reputations, and because their success in the game directly depends upon it, with consequences such as expulsion from the city and excommunication always looming as dangers that might end the game, players must expand their wealth in a way that favors long-term political and strategic goals. Thus, simply hoarding money or conducting only profitable business deals will not lead to success in the game, but on the contrary will lead to one or another fail state. While success from becoming the papal bank to forming the Medici Academy of the Arts is a great strategy that does lead to victory and makes art patronage vastly preferable over immediate profit. Art patronage provides a vital engine for accomplishing player goals in game, whether it is to boost their reputation with the city or to establish themselves further with the church. And Baxandao provides players with a historical justification and explication for their own success and failure. In fact, one of the reactions that my students was commonly voiced is trying to use Baxandao as a kind of guide for success in the game and finding it to be a much better strategic set of instructions than simple pursuit of profit. The assignment that I give is attached, you can see right here. As you can see, I ask my students to play the game, give them a brief introduction to what they'll be doing in it, and ask them to keep an informal journal of their choices, failures, and successes. This again encourages them to write down the events of the game in a kind of linear sort of personal history, where all the major landmarks, be it the attempted assassination attempt on Lorenzo de' Medici or the sack of Rome at the end of the game, become events that they've encountered for themselves and that have some sort of continuity for them. I also asked them to read Michael Baxandao's Conditions of Trade and use it to understand how and why the arts were supported, and to turn the journal and the response to the Conditions of Trade into a short essay describing what they did and why, how successful they were, and what artworks they've come to patronize. So in this course assignment, I get a lot of responses, and most of them are quite positive. Students not only recount the experience of the game and reflect upon what it means to be a patron, but often come to observe several key ideas that are often why I assign the game in the first place. The most interesting reactions to me are drawing a difference between the way Baxandao describes negotiations and the way negotiations are abstracted into the game. So then students say, well, in the game, they often just pay a lump sum of money to a single artist, and then the artist works for them for a while, or at least until they run out of money or insist upon some sort of delay. Whereas Baxandao describes negotiations that are so precise that they define the figures, the colors, the positioning, the size of the canvas, and virtually negotiate price by square foot. So this kind of observation is great. I'm so happy that students note this kind of difference because it makes them aware of what Baxandao notes and makes them sort of aware of how unusual and different this is from our own models for how an artistic patronage works. Furthermore, the second kind of big thing that I notice, students often note that pragmatic business decisions are often incommensurate with piety and good reputation. Thus, they start off simply trying to go for every profitable business deal, from loans with a good percentage to a cheap trade with the Ottoman Turks, but very quickly realize that both of those lead to terrible consequences, as they're punished for impiously participating in usury or trading with the enemies of the church. And as a result, players start to redefine their own sense of what is and isn't pragmatic, and realize that their own sense of the pragmatic is not universal. but rather historically specific and determined by the society around them. And again, this is the kind of insights that I want my students to make in class. And the fact that they come to it on their own in the course of experiencing patronage through ARTé Mecenas is wonderful. Finally, the last standard that really drives me in is not only are their sense of pragmatism undermined or kind of estranged by the experience, but their sense of ethics is estranged. Because to them, a lot of the times, and the way the game positions it, for example, asking the player to give a perfectly reasonable request for a loan from a respected friend or merchant is suddenly unethical because it's also usury, or a good deal with kind of faithful partners is unethical simply because they're Turkish, because of the church's own political and military concerns, or support for a family member who is in the church but known for corruption is a good decision, while turning on them is perhaps a bad decision, or again, unethical within these kind of within the standards of the society. All of these realizations are noted by the students' paper, and to me, huge, because I can tell them that in class, but this doesn't really sink in unless they really think through. And often these kinds of differences are very hard to grasp, precisely because they're naturalized and seen and universalized by the way we discuss them in contemporary life and in daily culture, to the point where we start thinking of artistic patronage as, the artist as a unique, independent creator, totally guided by their own inspiration, with a patronage as somebody who supports them with money. And these kinds of cliches and stereotypes that are completely historical to the Renaissance are exactly the hardest to eradicate in a classroom setting. And it's great that the game does it without ever feeling the students like they're unlearning something or being, in a sense, asked to abandon how they think about art. It simply exposes them to the way things work, and they come out of it saying, well, now I know how they work. I've felt it for myself. I've experienced it. I've gone through it. And this really changes things. The messages that we designed ask students to make choices about artworks. And the way this is presented is typically we'll get a question, and that question will ask them to pick out of 3. That's, for example, you see the question that we're offering here, where we ask students to select an image by Fra Angelico that reinforces the link between resurrection and salvation. We designed these images to both resemble one another formally and have certain affinities. For example, all 3 of these images have 2 figures in them, but ask them to apply their knowledge from class, such as what is the term resurrection mean, or what kind of common images represent it, and use their critical judgment rather than rote memorization to come to the right answer. Thus, in this case, only Noli Me Tangere can really provide the answer, as the other 2 all represent the Annunciation, so Christ's birth rather than resurrection. So students have to really engage with the iconography and with both the formal and conceptual and contextual meanings of the works in order to reach their answer. And the clues we provide guide them to this answer by hinting at what exactly they should think about or what they should work towards. So we have almost no answers that ask for rote memorization or any kind of sort of flashcard training, but rather more in-depth conceptual applications of complex knowledge gained in class and through the readings. Finally, for the students' uses of rote memorization, which, as we all know, is an important part of art history, we have the codex, which provides every image that the students acquire in the game, along with the name of the artist, the date, and the medium. And this codex can be useful not only for looking at the images closely and kind of gamifying the experience, so students have a sense of having built their own collection in the course of playing the game, but providing exactly the kind of flashcard exercise that students often need to memorize images in order to make complex conceptual judgments about them. So ARTé Mecenas does, in a sense, both jobs, offering a kind of memorization and rote memorization tool, but primarily focuses not on it, but rather on asking them to apply conceptual judgments, inferences, and other insights from class to analysis of images in order to succeed in the game. To summarize, ARTé Mecenas is a great supplement for both an in-person and online survey class. For in-person classes, it allows a closer focus on formal analysis in the classroom, and kind of takes out the load of the instructor to supplement a lot of their social, economic, and political context that we often, at least I often, struggle with comprehensively showing anyway. It does so for me and truly allows me to expect my students to know already how different patronage was in the Renaissance. For online classes, it's an engaging exercise consistent with the medium, so they'll be working basically on the same computers that they're taking the class with, but at the same time, it's a much needed source of interaction for what is often a passive experience. And again, one that really brings students into the whole fold by forcing them to figure out the conceptual frameworks that affect and transform art and the Renaissance for themselves in the course of untangling them and surviving through them. Amber, pass it on to you, and I think this conducts the end of our seminar, and now we will be ready to ask any questions or answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Danielle. This was such an engaging presentation. You provided great information. We've also been having a good discussion within the chat box. If you haven't already, please go ahead and enter any questions you have at this time into the chat box, and we'll discuss them in a second. And while you're entering your questions, I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you about Triceum. Triceum is an educational gaming studio formed in 2014 out of the Live Lab at Texas A&M University. We aim to improve student outcomes both in college and high school level by using learning games initially developed and prototyped within the Live Lab at Texas A&M. We have rigorous instructional design and research that are used to transform these educational experiences both in and out of the classroom. In addition, our game development team, which includes game designers, artists, and programmers, work closely with educational and research subject matter experts to create immersive experiences that achieve specific student learning outcomes. We are very interested in your feedback in general around ARTé Mecenas specifically and future art history and art appreciation games. There was a question in the chat about what future topics we are covering. We are working with a Live Lab at Texas A&M on 3 additional games currently, and we have more in the pipeline. So if you want to give us some feedback, what additional content we should look into or suggest, please fill out the survey and give us that feedback. In addition, we are dedicated to helping students master these concepts and ultimately succeed in your course. We're here to help, and we'd be happy to show you more about ARTé Mecenas and what it can do for you and your students. At the end of this webinar, we will be sending a recording within 24 hours. I sincerely thank everybody for taking the time today to listen to this webinar and ask questions. And with that, Danielle will start addressing some questions.
Sounds great. So what's the first question that we should address?
So the first question is, will it cover art history in Western tradition only?
Yes, at the moment, ARTé Mecenas is not just focused on the Western tradition, but specifically on a kind of on Medici patronage in Renaissance Italy. Now, this is generally in fitting with the way Southern Renaissance courses are taught, right? So there's a focus on Florence and on Rome, with a little attention to Venice. But besides that, it does not really go outside. On the contrary, it's a very focused look, which is why I pair it with Baxendale and his equally focused look.
We also had a question. You mentioned a well-known researcher earlier in your presentation.
I referred to Giorgio Lazari and Michael Baxendale. I'm not sure what a well-known researcher you mean. I'm sorry. I mentioned Ian Bogost, whose term procedural rhetoric is instrumental to me understanding of why games are useful. So Ian Bogost is a contemporary games theorist.
So Andrea, I hope that answered your question. If it did not answer your question, go ahead and type an additional question in the chat box.
I'd be glad to type the name if I'm pronouncing it in a problematic way.
And our next question discusses the topics within the game itself, and are the topics covered in the game presented chronologically as each artist is introduced?
No, there is some degree of chronologization and some degree of randomization. So we broke up the game into several levels, each of them covering sort of a broadly defined period, but the artists are distributed amongst the levels, approximately within the relative time span. But there is some sort of discontinuity, partially because the game randomizes some of the events, so no playthrough experience is completely the same. In one playthrough, you might encounter a given artist, and another counter might encounter a different artist during the same set of turns, and only certain events are sort of guaranteed to happen. So, for example, the opportunity to form the Medici Academy is going to come up even if the player doesn't take it. Michelangelo is going to become a factor even if the player isn't his direct patron and support. But there's no guarantee, for example, to get the Paolo Di Dono event or events connected to some other artists. The way that it's set up is that there's sort of event chains around several major artists or mini major artists, and if you start getting events from that chain, you'll essentially see all of them, unless you kind of end it early. But there's no guarantee that any given artist will be encountered within any given playthrough of the game.
Thank you, Daniil. So I answered this question in the chat box in regards to our players holistically across Triceum platform and within our research and IRB studies. But we're seeing students on average complete the game in 4 to 5 hours. What did you see in your class?
I didn't ask my students to complete the game. I asked them to play it long enough to get a sense of the experience that they can write about. Students who have completed the game, I think, took approximately that much. When I played through it, it took me 2.5 hours to complete it. But in general, most players describe making several tries at a level. And the way the levels are designed is that if you fail in the level, if you're, for example, excommunicated or kind of achieve another fail state, then you basically try again. And most players who were successful in their essays reported failing, realizing what they were doing wrong. For example, like I said, treating the business opportunities through a kind of anachronistic contemporary framework where profit is the most important thing, and realizing that they need to reorient themselves towards prestige or piety, and then succeeding in the level and moving on. So I think that players do complete it in just a few hours. It's a pretty limited exercise. The most successful people who are most successful with the game, who get the most out of it, tend to kind of play it for a while or play it to the end. So I think next time I run it, I might actually ask them to try to complete the game. But I do think that there's a lot to be gained just from the immediate immersive experience that it provides.
Thank you. So there's a question about, do we have a rubric with our student learning objectives? And I wanted to make everyone aware we do have a set of curriculum that I will be happy to send to anyone who contacts me. My email address is atm@triceum.com. The curriculum that we have has rubrics associated with it, but we don't have specific rubrics aligned to each SLO. If that's something you're interested in, we'd be glad to work on developing that. Daniil, do you use a rubric that, when grading, that you could share with everyone?
Well, since my texts are essays, I could share the rubric that I developed for my teaching assistant to help me grade, but it's not an SLO sort of rubric. It's a how to grade an undergraduate essay kind of rubric. So I'm not sure if my particular rubric would be that useful to other people, besides explaining what a good essay looks like, and that it needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, a thesis statement, things like that.
Can you comment a little bit about the level and the content oriented within the game and how it applies a little bit to the course? We had someone who joined just a little bit late. So when you're looking at the course from an SME perspective, where does the game fit best within the content?
I give it fairly early in the course. Basically, in the survey courses I teach, they begin in the kind of with the Renaissance, functionally, or late medieval, early Renaissance. And they tend to run through the 20th century. So I tend to give Mecenas in the early section when I cover Renaissance art, Mannerist art, and sort of talk about the kind of foundational basis of the class. So for me, I use it early, and I find that it's helpful to use it early because it readily establishes that we're not looking for universals, we're not looking for truth for all time. We're specifically looking at the historically specific. That's what art history does. It establishes the social and political and religious circumstances around an artwork, and it sort of really prepares them for that kind of thinking. So I use it early in the class. Now, I imagine if in a class that for example, runs classical to or cave art to the Renaissance, might more logically put it at the end. But in general, I think for me, it's worked really well to put it in the beginning and use it as this kind of foundational context establishing text.
Thanks, Danielle. So there's a question in the chat that I have to apologize. I must have missed it during the webinar. There's a question about, is there a way for faculty to take a look at it before having your students buy or purchase it? And yes, there is. We will work with faculty to set up accounts so that you can evaluate the game. To do that, you would contact Tim Neely at teneely@triceum.com, and we will work with anyone to set up these accounts within the next week. So please contact us if you're interested in evaluating the game prior to giving it to your students. And the last question we had is there a correlation between the time spent on the game and better test grades?
Do you want to answer that, Amber?
Since I assign my students essays, it doesn't lead towards a very natural measure. I mean, I don't ask them to write an essay before they play the game.
So we've recently conducted IRB-approved research studies with Texas A&M Department of Visualization that included students across Texas A&M, multiple different colleges and different disciplines. And what we saw in that study was from pre-test to post-test with a requirement of 2 hours of gameplay, we saw a 24.7% knowledge increase. We have not to date looked at comparative studies within a specific section with a faculty member. But we are very interested in conducting these comparative studies. And if you're interested in working with us or have an interest in doing comparative research studies, I would be glad to have a conversation with anyone on the webinar about future research and comparative studies. And with that, I believe we have answered all the questions that I had marked within the chat box. If I forgot your question, please go ahead and type in the question now into the chat box. We will continue to stay online for just a few minutes to see if there's additional questions rolling in. But again, I want to thank you for taking the time, Danielle, to present today, and everyone online participating in the webinar. We had a great discussion, and I hope you learned something about ARTé Mecenas and future use in your class. Please take the time to fill out the survey, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you for participating.